Now, if you recall from the slides, most of the examples that I gave you came from Opera. And the development team at Opera has spent the most time working on the enhancements to the forms controls. And you'll notice that the date items here look quite a bit different than the way that they did in Opera. And in the next part of this module, I'll show you how it looks in each one of the major browsers. But the first thing you might notice by looking at this page is that some of these items here look quite a bit different than what you might expect. So I'm showing you everything in Chrome right now, and it's attempting to work with these dates. We've got some spinners here, but it's not exactly what we'd expect. So I mentioned that just so that as you look at these controls, you might see something different than what you might have expected within the slides. But the thing that I do want to start you off by looking at is that I just refreshed this page, and you'll notice that the cursor is very nicely placed within the search box. Now, in the past, we've had to go through a number of different types of JavaScript gymnastics in order to autofocus a certain control on the page. And now what we have, though, is the ability to autofocus a control baked right into the page. Now, obviously, there's a rule that you can only have one item that has the autofocus applied to it. But when you add the autofocus attribute to your input control, that control will automatically get its focus. The next thing I would like to point out to you is if you take a look at this name box, in here I've got some hint text here, which is a watermark or a placeholder telling you that you need to put your first and your last name in. And again, this is another source of a place where we could add all kinds of JavaScript in order to make this happen, custom controls. This is just a common need that people often have, and so now it's provided directly within the functionality of the browser. So you simply add an attribute to your input control, and when there's no value found in that text box, then that placeholder text shows up. But if you start typing something and you bring focus off of it, then the little hint text doesn't show up again. So now that you have a picture of what these might look like, let's take a look at the markup. So let's begin at the top and start with this first form. I've separated these into different forms so you can kind of see a different purpose that I have set up for these input controls. Now, the second half of this module will deal with validation, but there may be a time in which you have a form that you don't want to validate. And in the sense of maybe a search box within a form, that might be a place where you don't want to apply validation rules. So the first thing I'm showing you here is that you can apply the no validate attribute to your form element, and that will stop that form from being run against any sort of validation rules. Now, do remember when you see some of these new attributes that, again, HTML5 is not an extension of XHTML. And the rule in XHTML was that every attribute must have a value. And that's not the case with HTML5. So just applying this no validate attribute to the code is perfectly acceptable. So as we go down the code here a little further, you'll notice that we have an input control. And like I said, the new controls that you're seeing are simply different types of input controls. So I don't have a new element necessarily that I'm declaring here on the page. I'm still declaring an input element. The only thing that's changed is now I have a search type available to me. And as we look down through this code, you'll see that depending on the type, there are other attributes that you can introduce into the element as well that will allow you to do different pieces of functionality with that input element. But for right now, I can say that I'd like this type to be a search type. And what that means, let's bring Chrome back over here for a moment, that once I start typing within the search text box, you notice that X appeared over on the right-hand side. So this is a user experience convention that we see all over the place when we're dealing with search boxes. And so if I click on that X, that clears out my search text. But the idea is that you have a box that allows you to use the search conventions that we found in most modern software. So just by applying the type of search, I now get a search box rendered in the browser. Now, in order to autofocus the search box, all I had to do was apply the autofocus attribute. And remember, like I said, this is one of those things where you can only apply one to a page because you can only autofocus to one input control. As we examine the rest of the code, the next input field that we were looking at was the name. And I wanted to start off with this because you'll notice this is our good friend input type equals text. And you've probably done thousands of these over the years. But this very familiar construction of an input control here, you can simply add the placeholder attribute, and that gives us the first and last, and then also a required attribute. Now, when we get into validation, we'll run a number of different validation rules against the input elements of a form. And checking to see if a required value is available to some of these controls is one of the rules that will be run. So again, just a plain vanilla text box. We're adding the placeholder, we're adding the required, and already we're getting some extra functionality into an input element that we're already used to using. Now, the idea behind these input types is to give you the support for the types of data that you're used to working with and collecting on a daily basis. So it's nothing spectacular, but now we have built-in ways of dealing with email addresses and URLs, telephone numbers, and even regular integers. So looking at this email item, you can see that we have the type equals email, and I can also apply the required attribute to it. Now, there's nothing else really that's special about this type, except for now when we go to do validation, we know that the email validation rule will fire against this input control, and that's the same for the URL and same for the phone. There is a little more that you can do with these by adding in a validation expression, but again, we'll get into that when we get into validation. So the next item that adds more attributes that we can deal with is the input type of number. And so when we have the input type of number, let's come down here to the number of years in development, and I'm typing text at this point. I'm just got my hand on the keyboard and I'm typing text, and you notice that nothing happens at all. Now, Chrome renders out the spin buttons for the numeric type here, and if I start clicking up 1, you can see it just starts with a value and begins to increment from there, and obviously it'll decrement to do the same. Now, to power that, I have the years in development, and I have the minimum number of years as 1 and the maximum number of years as 40. Now, that seems kind of like a ridiculous maximum, but let's just play with this for a little bit here. Let's say the minimum number of years is 5, and the step applied to this item is 2. And so now, if I were to refresh the page, if I up here on the spin button, you can see that we're going in steps of 2, starting with 5. So those attributes become very valuable when you start working with numbers, because now you can start to provide constraints to the values found within these input elements, again, directly within the browser. The range input type is an interesting one. Now, let's take a look here for a moment at the range input type. And here, this is rendered as a slider. And again, remember that the HTML5 spec does not talk about how input controls should look. It just talks about the functionality that they should provide. So when we look at this in Opera, we've got some nice tick marks underneath here, but in Chrome, it's just kind of a plain vanilla slider. Now, the thing that's interesting about this range is that it does not come out of the box with a way to report the value. This is something custom that I've done in JavaScript, but I thought it was important for you to be able to see how to do it. So when we're taking a look at the range input type, the type equals range, and then we can have a minimum value of 0 and a maximum value of 100, and step equals 1. So we'll just get anything within the range of 1 and 100. And the value itself, the applied value to it, is 50. So that's why when we first took a look at the page, the thumb showed up in the middle. And so all of these are configurable to whatever you want them to be. But let's scroll down the page a little bit and take a look at some of the script that I've written. And so I've got the range value here, which actually this is a span that's just on the page. So I'm getting reference to that span, and then I'm going to look at the input element, the dev experience range. And then I'm wiring up an event handler. So when the value is changed on that slider, then I take the value from the slider and plug that into the inner text of my span. So that happens on change, and then this line of code runs when the page is first run in order to give the span the initial value. So there's a little bit of script involved in order to give some feedback to the user of what the actual value is. And sometimes you'll use this and sometimes you won't, but I did want to give you an opportunity to see how it looks in order to report the value. It kind of seems like that should be an option that you could just turn on in the control, like add an attribute to show what the value is. So this seemed kind of important to me. So if we scroll back up to the markup, you can see that here's the span that I'm reporting the range value to, and again, the slider is rendered from this code right here. Now, the next one I'd like to show you isn't really a new input type. You can see here from t-shirt color, the type equals text. And so this is just a regular text box that we're used to using, except the attribute that we're using here is list. And so this list, the value of this list points to an ID on the page of a data list. And so what this data list allows us to have is a number of different options. So here we're talking about t-shirt colors. You can have blue, red, or green. And the way this data list works, and if you recall from the slides, you've seen a screenshot of this. The data list works by when you go to an input control, you click on it, and underneath it, it shows this list of data, or just a little, kind of like a drop-down list. Now, I would love to show you what it looks like. Unfortunately, there's some sort of a bug within Opera, which happens to be the only browser that implements the data list, the background color, and all the date controls with the rich functionality of them. For some reason, as I'm doing a screen capture, it will not show those controls the way they're supposed to. It won't pop up the drop-down list, or it won't show the calendar control on some of the date items. So I won't be able to show you some of the interactive portions of these controls as I'm screencasting. For some reason, when I do it on this monitor, it doesn't work. When I do it on the other monitor where I'm not trying to record the screen, it works just great. But I'll continue to show you the rest of the code, and I can show you what I can of how it displays within the browsers. So color here is a new input type for us. And so all we need to do is say that we want a color and then give it a value, an RGB color here. I can show you within Opera here that it does render up as a picker. So when I click on this, nothing really happens. Again, you did see in the slides though the type of color picker that it would render under normal circumstances. Then I have a number of different date types here. So I've got the date, date time local, time, and then also month. And so this gives you an opportunity to really focus in the type of date and time, and even week down here that's just coming up as I scroll here. So you can really focus on the type of time information that you want to get out of your form. And each of them have the different values and attributes. I've kind of mixed and matched them here so you can see. So they have value, minimum, and maximum, so that you can constrain the type of value that comes through. And you'll see here that date just deals with a date in time. Date time gives us the date and also the time of the day that we're working with. Date time local allows us not have to worry about any sort of time zone considerations. Time is just the time of day that we're dealing with. And month and week give you a chance to constrain date information down to either just a month or the week itself. When we're talking about months, the convention is the year dash the month number. And when we're talking about weeks, the convention is year dash a capital W and the week of the year. So we have 52 weeks of the year. This would be the middle of the year around week 26. So now that you've seen what the code looks like, I'd like to take you through a little tour of how some of the controls render in each one of the browsers.